Welcome back, everyone, to the channel Confessions of the Elderly. My brother-in-law went bankrupt, and my mother-in-law wanted to borrow my land deed to mortgage for 3 billion dong to pay off his debt. When I refused, she immediately lunged at me and slapped me. My husband said one sentence that caused her to crumble instantly. My name is Latu Han, I am 34 years old, and I work as a chief accountant for a small construction firm. My job isn't glamorous, and it doesn't involve the kind of dizzying profits you hear about. But in return, I am used to precise figures, where every expense, every cent flowing in or out, must be accounted for. Perhaps it is because of this profession that I am terrified of debt. I am not afraid of being poor, nor am I afraid of living life at a slower pace than others. I only fear that one day, out of greed or gullibility, our whole family will be dragged into a bottomless pit of debt. My husband, Nguyen Minh Quan, is a mechanical engineer. He is a man of few words, not good at flattering anyone, and certainly doesn't know how to show off. But he is the type of man who lives transparently, spends only what he earns, and loves his wife and children in very quiet ways. In contrast to Quan, my mother-in-law, Mrs. Du T Lee, is someone who cares deeply about face. To her, it's everything. Success is not just a private matter, but something to show off to relatives and neighbors, and the one she is most proud of is my brother-in-law, Nguyen Minh Dong. Dong is the eldest son, working in a fintech company. He is always dressed sharply, wears shiny watches, switches cars constantly, and always talks about flashy topics like investments, margins, cash flow, and life-changing opportunities. Whenever relatives gather for a meal, Mrs. Lee sits in the center, grinning until her eyes squint shut. She pats Dong on the shoulder and brags, "My eldest son is a different man now. He is sharp-minded. His money generates more money with every turn, and soon he'll buy more land and get me a new car to ride around in." After saying that, she glances at Quan, half joking and half serious. As for Quan, he's just too soft, clinging to a meager engineer's salary, living an unambitious life. Who knows when he'll ever get ahead? During those times, I usually stayed silent, and Quan wouldn't argue either. He just kept his head down and put food on my plate as if he were used to such comparisons, but I knew deep down it wasn't easy for him. Once back in our room, he sighed and told me, "Don't count money as yours until it's firmly in your hands." I don't know how Dong makes his money, but Mom brags about him too much. It will be hard to face people if something goes wrong later. I felt the exact same way. It wasn't that I hated Dong, and it certainly wasn't jealousy, but every time I heard him talk about investing in crypto, tripling his money, doubling it this month and quintupling it the next, a chill would run down my spine. Dong spoke so easily, as if money were just lying on the street waiting for someone to bend down and pick it up. As an accountant, I know very well that in this world, the faster something promises a profit, the more careful you need to be. Yet, Mrs. Lee would never listen. Once, Quan gently advised his mother, "Mom, please don't brag about Dong so much. Investments have their ups and downs, it's better to keep a low profile." She immediately darkened her expression and slammed her cup down on the table. "Your brother dares to think and act. That's why he's rich. As for you, you just cling to your measly salary and then go around lecturing someone who makes money better than you do." Truth be told, people are measured by their guts. Quan didn't say another word, and I remained silent as well. But from that very day, I had a bad premonition. I just didn't expect the day everything collapsed would come so soon. That evening, I got off work late. On the way home, it was drizzling, and the roads were slick and cold. I only wished to get home, shower, eat a hot meal, and get some rest. But as soon as I opened the door, I saw the living room brightly lit, the atmosphere heavy enough to be suffocating. Quan stood near the window with a tense face, Mrs. Lee stood in the middle of the room clutching her shirt, and Dong sat slumped on the chair, his shirt wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes bloodshot as if he hadn't slept for nights. I froze. The man who once went everywhere smelling of expensive perfume, in crisp clothes, speaking of billions as if it were nothing. Now, all that stands before me is an empty shell. Dong looked up at me, his lips trembling, his voice raspy. "I'm out of options, I'm over 3 billion in debt." I stood frozen. 3 billion. Those two words dropped into the living room like a heavy stone. Before I could ask who he borrowed from, the terms, or where the papers were, Dong clutched his head and went on. He said he invested in crypto, following some colleagues from work. At first, it was real profit. Money hit his account quickly, it seemed easy. He borrowed more to pour into it. When the market crashed, his account was wiped out. Unwilling to accept it, he took high-interest loans to recover, sinking deeper, interest on interest, finally totaling over 3 billion. I looked at Quan. His face had gone pale, but his eyes were still sharp. He asked slowly, "Who did you take those high-interest loans from?" Dong did not answer immediately. Mrs. Lee immediately chimed in, her voice trembling but still trying to maintain an authoritative tone. "Now is not the time to ask about such things. The priority is saving your brother first." I was just about to say I needed to see the debt papers and distinguish principal from interest, but Mrs. Lee turned sharply toward me. Her eyes at that moment didn't look like a panicked mother's, but like someone who had already devised a plan and was just waiting for my nod. She spoke each word clearly, like a command. "Han, tomorrow you bring your house deed. Mother needs to mortgage it at the bank to borrow 3 billion to save Dong." I went numb. The room suddenly fell so silent that I could clearly hear the rain tapping on the eaves. I looked at Mrs. Lee, then at Dong, who had his head hung low, and finally at my husband. I understood that the true storm for my family didn't start with that 3 billion debt. It started the moment my mother-in-law saw my house as a lifebuoy for the son she had spoiled to the point of ruin. I stared at my mother-in-law for a long time, thinking I had misheard. The house she just mentioned is not the husband's family asset, nor is it something that can be mortgaged just because she wants to. That is the house my biological parents gave to me alone before my wedding day. The legal documents clearly bear my name. Back then, my father said something I have remembered ever since. A daughter doesn't get married just to enter someone else's house with nothing to her name. This house is my last safety net. No matter what happens in the future, I must never let it go easily. After we got married, my husband and I moved into that house. The renovation costs, furniture, utilities, and monthly expenses were all covered by us. My husband's family didn't contribute a single penny, but I never brought that up. I simply thought that as a married couple, there was no need to keep score. But the moment my mother-in-law asked to mortgage my property deed, I realized that staying silent for too long makes others think it's their right. I set my bag on the chair and tried to keep my voice calm. "Mom, do you understand that this house is my personal property?" Mrs. Lee was standing in the middle of the room. Her face darkened as soon as I spoke. She looked at me as if I had just said something incredibly unfilial. "Personal property? What are you talking about? Since you're a daughter-in-law of this family, what's yours is ours. Husband and wife living together, yet you're so good at drawing lines?" I felt a lump in my throat as I listened. She usually hinted at the house, but she had never been this shameless and blunt. Dung kept his head down, wringing his hands together. A moment later, he looked up, his voice hoarse. "Sister-in-law, please help me this once. I'll pay you back as soon as I scrape the money together. I promise, if I get through this, I won't forget the favor you and my brother did for me." I looked at the man before me. Just a few months ago, he was chest-thumping, saying, "As long as you know how to seize opportunities, making billions isn't hard." And yet, now that same person is begging me to use my parents' house to save him. I asked bluntly, "What guarantee do you have that you'll pay me back? Is this a real debt, or is it one inflated by others? Do you have the paperwork? Who did you borrow from? What's the interest rate? What are the payment terms?" Dung stayed silent, a clear look of embarrassment flashing across his face. But before he could answer, Mrs. Lee snapped at me. "Are you interrogating him like a police officer? He is your brother-in-law. He is flesh and blood to this family. If you won't save family, why are you even keeping that house? To worship it?" Those words felt like a knife cutting straight into my heart. It turns out that in her eyes, the house my parents scrimped their whole lives to give me is only valuable when used to save her son. I took a deep breath. "Mom, I never said I would ignore Dung. If there is truly a debt, the whole family can sit down, review the paperwork, negotiate with the lenders, and find a legal way to resolve it. But I cannot mortgage the house for a shady cryptocurrency debt, with no clear principal, no interest terms, and no known party behind it. As an accountant, I know that signing the wrong document could ruin a person's life forever." Mrs. Lee scoffed, her smile icy cold. "Very well, all this talk is just you being stingy. You're afraid of losing the house, afraid of the debt, and you couldn't care less if your husband lives or dies. I raised my son to this age, and now that he's in trouble, I have to go begging my daughter-in-law. My family must be truly cursed to have taken someone like you in." Hearing his mother, Dung lowered his head and covered his face, his shoulders shaking as if he were crying. "Mom, just forget it. I guess this is my fate. In 3 days, they are coming to the house, and I don't know how I'll survive." I looked at him immediately. "Who is they?" Dung froze. I continued, asking every word clearly. You said they are coming in 3 days, so are they from a bank, a financial firm, or is it an unofficial loan with a contract? What is the interest rate? Who is the guarantor? Show me the paperwork. The living room fell silent. Đăng avoided my gaze, his lips moving but unable to utter a single word. That silence made me even more certain that something was deeply wrong. If it were just a normal investment debt, why wouldn't he dare show the papers? If he truly wanted the family's help, why is everything so vague? The only demand is to get my property deed. I turned to my mother-in-law, but before I could speak, she slammed her hand down on the table. The water glass trembled, sloshing over onto the glass surface. I don't need you to lecture me on the law. She gritted her teeth, her eyes reddening with rage. And I don't need you interrogating my son. All I need is for you to hand over the property deed. Tomorrow, exactly tomorrow, you will take the documents to the bank with me. I stood still, clearly hearing my heart beating in my chest. For the first time after years as a daughter-in-law, I saw my mother-in-law's true face clearly. When she needs me to cook, she calls me daughter-in-law. When she needs me to contribute money, she calls me family. But when she needs my house, she no longer hides anything. In her eyes, I am neither a child nor a relative. I am just a key to open the door to save the son she personally spoiled until he fell into the abyss. I looked straight at Mrs. Lee, not that I wasn't afraid, with her on one side, my brother-in-law in debt on the other, and my husband standing there with a heavy expression. But there are boundaries. If I take one step back today, I will never have the right to say no again. I spoke slowly, every word clear. I will not hand over the land deed. As soon as those words left my lips, Mrs. Lee's expression changed instantly. She stood up abruptly, the wooden chair behind her pushed back with a grating screech, her face flushed red, and her eyes filled with fury. Say that again. She growled. I stood still. I already said it, I cannot mortgage my parents' house for Đang's debt. Before I could say anything else, she lunged at me. Everything happened so fast that I only saw her hand swing before my eyes. A sharp slap echoed through the living room, my face turned to one side, my ears rang, my cheek burned as if scorched by fire, the room suddenly went dead silent, the sound of rain on the porch seemed to fade, leaving only my heart pounding in my chest. I stepped back, my hand instinctively touching my cheek. It hurt, it really hurt. But what chilled me more than the slap were the gazes of those in the room. Mrs. Lee panted, showing not a hint of regret. Đăng kept his head down, his hands clenched tight, but he didn't say a word to intervene. As if that slap was only natural, the price I had to pay for daring to keep my own property. Mrs. Lee pointed her finger directly at my face, her voice breaking with rage at the kind of daughter-in-law who would hoard her own wealth while her husband's family is in crisis. You've eaten this family's food for years, and now that your husband is at death's door, you still stand there lecturing his mother about the law. I pressed my lips together, my eyes stung, but I did not cry. I didn't want her to see my tears. Even more, I didn't want that slap to turn me into a weak woman trembling and begging for fairness from people who never considered me family. I turned to look at Quan. From the moment everything happened, he had just stood there as if nailed to the spot. In that moment, I didn't need him to do anything grand. I just wanted to know where the man I call my husband would choose to stand. Would he stay silent like so many men who choose peace with their own mothers, or would he face the truth that his wife had just been insulted in her own home? Quan stepped forward. His pace was not hurried, but very firm. He placed his hand on my shoulder and pulled me behind him. His hand was slightly trembling, but his grip was steady. I looked at his back before me, and my throat suddenly tightened. After so many comparisons and so many times of being looked down upon by my mother-in-law, that quiet man finally stood up for me. He looked straight at Mrs. Lee, his voice not loud, but so cold the entire room seemed to freeze. If you slap my wife one more time, I will remove you and Đăng from this house tonight. Mrs. Lee was stunned, as if she couldn't believe those words had come from the mouth of the youngest son she always thought was gentle and obedient. She opened her mouth, unable to find words for several seconds. Then she pointed a trembling finger at Quan. What did you just say? Are you kicking your mother out because of this woman? Quan did not flinch. He answered immediately, I am not kicking you out because of my wife. I just will not allow anyone to strike my wife in her own home. That statement made Mrs. Lee's face turn pale. Đăng also jerked his head up, his expression a mix of panic and anger. Perhaps it was only then that he remembered something the rest of my husband's family had deliberately forgotten. The place they are standing in is not their property. Kwon continued slowly, but every word hit the floor like a nail. This house belongs to Han. The title deed is in Han's name. Her parents gave it to her before we were married. You are standing in my wife's house demanding to take her deed. Do you really think that is right? Mrs. Lee staggered as if someone had slapped her back. Just seconds ago, she held the upper hand, pointing her finger and calling me a selfish daughter-in-law. Yet now, a single sentence from Kwon has laid it all bare. The family card she used to pressure me suddenly seemed pitifully shameless. She couldn't speak anymore, only gasping for air, eyes turning red, humiliated and furious. Đăng jumped up, his voice hoarse. Kwon, how can you say something like that? I am your own brother. Kwon turned to look at him, his gaze devoid of any respect. It is exactly because you are my brother that I am speaking up here. If you have debts, you must show the paperwork and find a way to pay them. You cannot let mom hit my wife and then force her to use her house to save you. The room sank into silence once again. I stood behind Kwon, my cheek still stinging, but my mind was strangely clear. Mrs. Lee's slap didn't just hit my face. It shattered the facade of harmony this family has kept for so long. And Kwon's words made her realize that this time, they couldn't use the bond of blood to make us bow our heads any longer. Mrs. Lee stood frozen for a moment, then suddenly burst into tears. Her sobbing didn't sound like remorse, but rather a way to regain the upper hand. She beat her chest, pointing at Kwon while crying. Oh God, I raised my son all these years only for him to stand in front of me defending his wife, kicking out his mother and abandoning his brother. Do you still consider me your mother, Kwon? Your brother is in trouble, and instead of helping, you side with your wife to humiliate your mother. If it were any other time, Kwon would have probably stayed silent. He never liked arguing with his mother, nor did he want family matters to cause a scene. But that evening, I saw a different kind of resolve in my husband's eyes. He didn't offer long explanations, nor did he back down to appease her. He turned and walked straight toward the wooden cabinet against the living room wall, opened the bottom drawer, and took out an old blue file. I looked at the file in his hand and froze for a moment. I didn't know how long Kwon had been keeping it. He placed the file on the table and opened each page in front of Mrs. Lee and Đăng. His voice was chillingly calm. Mom, you say this house belongs to the husband's family. Then read this clearly. This is the deed of gift for separate property. This is the land use rights certificate in Han's name. My in-laws gifted this house before Han and I were legally married. Mrs. Lee looked at the papers, her lips moving, but she couldn't utter a word. Kwon pushed another paper toward her. And this is the notarized commitment of separate property. If you don't know the law, let me put it simply. This house is not our marital property, and it has nothing to do with our family. From start to finish, you have no right to touch it. I stood beside Kwon, my throat tightening. It turned out he knew everything, having silently kept all the documents just in case. Yet, for all these years, whenever he heard his mother tell relatives that our family had helped pay for this house, he stayed silent. I used to think he didn't notice or wanted to avoid conflict, so he let it slide. But no, he knew. He was just trying to keep some peace for me in this marriage. Kwon looked at his mother and continued, for years, you've told our relatives that our family contributed money to buy this house. You made everyone think Han owes my family a debt, so she has to endure, be sensible, and obey. I didn't speak up because I agreed. I didn't speak up because I thought you still knew where to draw the line. He paused for a moment and then emphasized every word. But tonight, you crossed that line. Mrs. Lee's face turned pale, then red. She quickly turned away, her voice sharp to hide her embarrassment. Does it kill anyone if I say that? When outsiders ask, I say it to save face for the family. Should I let people know the groom's side couldn't contribute anything? I'm saving face for you both, and now I'm the one in the wrong? Hearing that, I felt a cold chill run through my heart. For years, I thought those boasts were just her vanity and not worth minding. But now I understand that very vanity turned me into a debtor in the eyes of my in-laws. And once they thought I owed them, they naturally felt my money, home, and labor were theirs to claim. Kwon didn't stop there. He pulled another bank statement from the folder and placed it on the table. Mom, "Do you remember the 300 million Han transferred to you last year?" Mrs. Lee immediately stiffened. I was startled and turned to look at my husband. "I remember that transaction very clearly. Back then, Mrs. Lee said the ancestral hall was deteriorating and the clan needed urgent contributions. She said anyone who didn't contribute would be ridiculed by the relatives. I didn't want to put Kwan in a tough spot, so I transferred the money to her. I even comforted myself by thinking it was fulfilling my duty as a daughter-in-law." Mrs. Lee glanced at the statement and quickly said, "I used that money for the clan's affairs. It's all family money. Why keep track of it like this? Are you really going to nitpick over a few pennies with your mother?" Kwan turned to Dong. "Tell the truth. Did those 300 million go into your crypto investment account?" The whole room went silent. Dong hung his head, his shoulders tense. I could clearly see sweat beading on his forehead. 1 second, 2 seconds, and a long time passed without an answer. But that very silence said it all. My heart felt like it was being squeezed. It turns out the money I transferred, thinking it was for our ancestors, ended up in Dung's crypto sinkhole. I looked at Mrs. Lee. "You knew about this from the beginning, didn't you?" She avoided my gaze but remained defiant. "So what if I did? I just wanted to help him succeed in business. If he turned a profit, the whole family would benefit. Who would have thought it would end up like this?" Hearing her, my slapped cheeks suddenly burned even hotter. Not from the pain, but from the humiliation. I had been tricked by the word duty, using my hard-earned money to bail out a gamble without even knowing it. Cornered, Mrs. Lee immediately turned to attack me. "This is all your fault. Ever since he married you, Kwan has changed completely. He used to be gentle, loving toward his mother and brother. Now you've egged him on to pull out papers and settle scores with the woman who gave him life. Women from outside the family are truly only good at driving mothers and sons apart." Kwan slammed his hand down on the table. Not loudly, but enough to make her go silent. He looked at his mother, his gaze both pained and firm. "No one is driving us apart. You and brother Dung turned my wife's kindness into a bottomless wallet." He turned to me and continued, speaking slowly, as if ending years of silent endurance. "From today on, no money, no documents, and no assets of ours are to be touched by you or brother Dung ever again. If there is one more time like tonight, I will do exactly what the law allows." Mrs. Lee slumped into her chair, her hands trembling as she clutched the stack of papers on the table. Dung kept his head bowed, his face deathly pale. And I stood there, realizing for the first time that the problem wasn't just the 3 billion dong debt. The problem was that for so long, my kindness had been bargained with, hidden, and exploited bit by bit. And that night, when Kwan laid each paper out in front of his mother, the facade of a loving family in my husband's home was torn apart beyond repair. That night, after Kwan laid all the documents out before his mother and brother, the house fell into a heavy silence. Mrs. Lee stopped crying and making a scene. Dung didn't dare utter another complaint. But that very silence made me feel more uneasy than the arguments had. People only go quiet when they have realized the truth or when they are plotting something else. With my mother-in-law and Dung, I dare not believe it was a change of heart. I went to my room and sat at my desk for a long time. My cheek was still aching from the slap. But it wasn't the pain that made my hands go cold. I opened all the old messages and bank transfer statements, all the times Mrs. Lee asked to borrow money for various reasons, sometimes for ancestral hall donations, sometimes for medicine for the eldest uncle, sometimes to lend to Dung for his business ventures. Before, I only felt annoyed and tired, but I had never connected them all together. The more I look, the stranger it seems. Every time Dung brags about a profitable investment, Mrs. Lee quietly messages me to ask for a loan. One time, just the night before, he boasted about making hundreds of millions in profit. The next morning, my mother-in-law said she urgently needed 50 million for an emergency on their end. Once, Dung posted photos of a fancy dinner. 2 days later at noon, Mrs. Lee called, begging, "Han, please send me some money. I'll pay you back at the end of the month." When these timelines are placed side by side, a chilling truth emerges. Dung is not as wealthy as she claims. He has likely been losing money for a long time, using a flashy exterior to hide an ever-deepening hole. I called Kwan over. He sat next to me, looking at the bank statements on the screen, his expression growing somber. I whispered, "Do you think Dung was already in debt?" Kwan didn't answer immediately. He just pulled my notebook over and used a pen to circle each transaction date. After a while, he said, "No need to wonder anymore. It's obvious. We just didn't want to believe it before." No sooner had he finished speaking than my phone suddenly rang. An unknown number appeared on the screen. I intended to hang up since it was late, but Quan held my hand and signaled for me to put it on speaker. On the other end was a stranger's voice, speaking very smoothly. "Hello, Ms. Han, I'm from the Financial Support Department. I'd like to confirm that your family is bringing the land deed tomorrow to process the loan application, right? We have already received the property information. As soon as the homeowner signs, the funds will be disbursed quickly." I felt a chill run through my entire body. Quan looked up sharply, his eyes hardening. I tried to keep my voice calm. "What application are you talking about? I have never agreed to take out any loan." The man on the other end hesitated for a moment, then quickly laughed it off. Perhaps Mr. Dung hasn't discussed it thoroughly with you yet. He has already submitted the application. It includes copies of the property deed, ID information, and full address. We are just missing the owner's signature. I gripped the phone so hard my fingertips turned white. In that moment, everything felt like it was cracking right before my eyes. They weren't just asking to borrow the deed, they had already prepared the paperwork. Meaning, before Mrs. Lee slapped me and before Dung knelt to beg for help, they had already planned to use my house as collateral. Last night was just a setup to force me into a trap they had already laid out. Quan gestured for him to speak. His voice dropped. "Who sent the files to you? When were they sent? What documents does the file contain?" The man on the other end started to stammer. "Well, my side only receives the information. For details, please discuss it with your family member." Quan spoke immediately. "If your side continues to hold or use my wife's personal documents without consent, I will file a report." The other end went silent for a few seconds, then hurriedly said he would check, and hung up. The air in the room became stiflingly heavy. Quan stood up and walked straight to the filing cabinet. That cabinet was always locked, but because his mother and brother were in the house, we often didn't guard it too closely. He opened every drawer, checking every folder. A moment later, his face darkened. The photocopy of the house deed, our ID photocopies, and the marriage certificate copy were all gone. I sat there, stunned. I didn't want to believe it, but everything was so clear that I couldn't lie to myself any longer. Quan grabbed his phone and walked down to the living room. I followed behind him. Mrs. Lee and Dung were still sitting there, but seeing Quan's expression, both seemed guilty. Quan placed his phone on the table and played back the recording of the call. Every word from the man at the financial firm rang out clearly in the room. Dung's face went pale first. Mrs. Lee tried to maintain her composure, but her hands twisting her shirt betrayed everything. Quan looked straight at them and asked slowly, "Who took the papers from my cabinet?" No one answered. He asked again, his voice sharper this time, "Who gave the house information to the lender?" Mrs. Lee stood up in a hurry, her voice strained. "You two must have misplaced them somewhere and someone found them. How would I know? Besides, they're just photocopies. What can you even do with those? Don't make a mountain out of a molehill." I looked at her, feeling my heart grow cold. Even now she was still in denial, offering no apology, showing no fear that her daughter-in-law had been dragged into a loan application against her will. Quan let out a laugh, but the smile was so cold it made me shudder. He took out his phone and opened a message from the bank that had been sent to me this morning, which I hadn't noticed. It was a verification code to check property information from a lender. Quan placed the screen in front of Mrs. Lee and Dung. "I've already called to verify. The file was created using Dung's phone number. The referral was made by Mother." Mrs. Lee froze as if someone had choked her. Dung jumped up, stammering, "Quan, I was just doing it ahead of time to meet the deadline. If Han agreed, she would sign. If not, she wouldn't. There's nothing to be so tense about." Quan looked at his brother, each word falling heavily. "You filed a loan application with my wife's documents before she even agreed to it. You call that nothing?" Dung tried to say more, but Quan cut him off. "Listen to me clearly. From this moment on, any hope of touching Han's house is completely over. Tomorrow morning I will change the locks on the file cabinet and work with the lender to demand the cancellation of all unauthorized files. If my wife's documents appear anywhere else, I will report it immediately. At that point, it won't be a family matter anymore." Mrs. Lee's voice trembled. "Are you intending to put your own brother in jail?" Quan answered immediately without a moment's hesitation. "No, I am stopping him from dragging the whole family into a cell." That statement left her speechless. Dung slumped back into his chair, his face ashen like someone who had just lost their final escape route. I stood beside Quan looking at the mother and son. The noisy anger in my heart was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow chill. They no longer had any way to touch my house. Their hope had been cleanly extinguished by Kwon, leaving no room for a comeback. But precisely for that reason, I knew they wouldn't stop. When a person is pushed to the wall and still refuses to admit fault, they will find something else to cling to. And at that moment, I didn't know that their next target would no longer be the house under my name. The next morning, Kwon did exactly what he said he would. He changed the file cabinet locks, called the lenders to demand they delete all information related to my house, and sent confirmation emails to keep as evidence. From that moment on, Mrs. Lee didn't mention the red book again. Đăng also stopped kneeling and begging like he did that first night. Both of them were so silent that I felt as if a thick fog had descended upon this house. It felt like walking on thin ice, where a single wrong step would lead to a fall. 3 days later, Mrs. Lee's attitude began to change. She no longer yelled, cried, or slammed the table demanding the red book. In the morning, she called to ask if I had eaten yet. In the afternoon, she brought over a container of chicken soup, saying she simmered it for Kwon to build up his strength. I looked at the warm soup on the table, but my heart felt no warmth at all. Someone who just slapped me over a property deed turning gentle after only a few days, that couldn't be simple remorse. Kwon realized it too. He didn't say much, just told me, whatever mom says, just listen, don't promise anything. From now on, leave all matters related to money and assets for me to handle. I nodded. After several sleepless nights, I understood very clearly. With Mrs. Lee, sudden kindness is often just a detour when the direct path is no longer viable. That evening, I was in my office checking the company books. The door was ajar, so the voices from the living room carried quite clearly. Mrs. Lee arrived in the afternoon saying she wanted to see Kwon privately. I intended to step away to let them talk, but as soon as I heard the words, "the apartment," my hands froze on the keyboard. Mrs. Lee's voice was quieter than usual, soft to the point of being artificial. "Kwon, I've thought it over, I won't touch Han's house anymore. I know you're angry with me, but that mini apartment is a shared asset of you too, isn't it? Why don't you sell it for now, son?" I sat motionless. That apartment was the only major shared asset my husband and I owned. We bought it 3 years ago when the price was still affordable. We don't live there, we rent it out. It brings in 20 million a month. That amount isn't enough to change our lives, but it's a steady income that helps us save for emergencies, unemployment, or when we have kids. Mrs. Lee continued, her voice choking up, "Save your brother first. Houses can always be bought again later. Are you really going to let your own brother be hounded to death by debt collectors?" Đăng sat next to her and immediately chimed in, his arrogance now replaced by desperation. "Kwon, are you really not going to save me? I know I was wrong before, I was boastful and looked down on you, but I'm drowning here. Can't you throw me a lifebuoy just this once?" Hearing that, I felt a bitter sense of irony. When he had money, whether real or fake, he called Kwon a wage slave with no ambition. Now that debt surrounds him, he suddenly remembers the meaning of brotherhood. As for Mrs. Lee, she stopped demanding my private house but immediately set her sights on something else she could sell. To her, as long as there is an asset in sight, she will find a way to turn it into a lifeline for her son. Kwon remained silent for quite a while. I knew he was holding back his anger. He asked slowly, "What if we sell it and it's still not enough?" The living room fell silent, no one could answer. Kwon continued, 3 billion is the number Đăng claimed, but so far there's no clear debt paperwork, no interest rate mentioned, and the lenders are vague. If we sell the apartment for over 2 billion and still have debt left, what do you plan to sell next? Sell the car, sell the furniture, or go back to pressuring Han? Mrs. Lee stammered, "No, it won't reach that point. As long as there's money up front, your brother can manage." Kwon turned on his phone, opened the apartment lease agreement, and placed it in front of his mother. "This apartment brings in 20 million steadily every month. This is our family's safety net. Selling it now is cutting off our own legs, and Đang's debt still might not even be resolved." Mrs. Lee immediately changed her tone. "Money can be earned back, but what about our own flesh and blood? Are you going to keep calculating things like a stranger?" Kwon looked at his mother, his eyes turning cold. Blood ties do not give anyone the right to drag the whole family into the abyss. If he made a mistake, he has to bear the consequences. I can help find a lawyer, help negotiate, and help categorize which debts are legal. But selling my wife's and my assets to pay off some shady debt, that, I will not do. At that very moment, Kwon's phone rang. It was the number of the woman renting our apartment. As soon as he answered, the woman's voice on the other end was frantic. "Kwon, this afternoon, Two strangers came by asking about the apartment. They said they were your family members and wanted to check its condition to proceed with a sale. One of them even stood in the hallway taking photos of the door and the electricity and water meters. I felt something was wrong, so I called to let you know. I stepped out of the study, looking straight at Ms. Lee and Deng. They both froze. Deng's face went pale for a second, while Ms. Lee quickly looked away. Quan hung up and placed his phone on the table, his voice terrifyingly calm. So, Mom, you didn't just come up with this idea to sell the apartment tonight. You two had planned this all along. No one answered, but their silence was answer enough. Quan stood up and grabbed his car keys. He turned to me. Let's head to the apartment right now. Then he looked at his mother and brother, his words sharp as knives. You two are not to touch Han's house. And don't even dream of touching our apartment. From now on, if anyone tries to approach the tenant, or messes with papers or transactions related to that place, I will no longer consider you family. I followed Quan to the door, while Ms. Lee called out weakly behind us, Quan, how can you be so heartless to your own brother? Quan didn't turn back, but he replied very softly, yet loud enough for the whole room to hear, I am just trying to protect my own little family's survival. I am not the one being heartless. Quan drove very fast but remained silent the entire way. I sat beside him, my hands clasped tightly together, feeling as if I were burning inside. That apartment isn't some luxury to show off, but the savings my husband and I built up over years of working and saving every little bit. Yet in just a few days, after failing to get their hands on my house, Mrs. Lee and her son immediately shifted their focus to this one. When the car stopped at the apartment lobby, the tenant was already waiting. Her name is Thou, an office worker who has been renting our apartment for nearly a year. Seeing us, she hurried over, her face still showing signs of panic. I'm sorry for calling so late, but I feel like something isn't right. This afternoon, two men came by, saying they were your relatives and wanted to see the apartment to prepare transfer papers. My heart sank the moment I heard the word transfer. Quan kept his voice calm as he asked, did they enter the apartment? Thou nodded, her hands clutching her phone tightly. Yes, one of them looked like Mr. Deng. I saw him with his mother in the lobby the other day. The other man was wearing a black shirt and carrying a briefcase. Quote, they said you were busy and asked them to come and check the current condition. Thou said the two men walked around the house, opened the balcony, looked at the ceiling and walls, and measured the living room with an electronic device. They even asked how much longer her lease was and if she would be willing to move out early if the owner sold the place. The man in the black shirt kept taking videos and photos of every corner of the apartment, including the utility meters in the hallway. She felt it was strange at the time, so she purposely gave vague answers and didn't sign or confirm anything. I stood in the middle of the living room, looking at every familiar object, feeling a chill run through me. This is where we hand-picked the curtains, the dining table, and every small lamp, thinking it would make our tenants feel at home. And later, if needed, we could keep it for our child. Yet in Mr. Deng's eyes, it is just an item to be sold off quickly, as long as he gets money to fill the hole he dug himself. Quan asked the building management to pull the hallway security footage. Luckily, because Thou reported it immediately, the data was still there. We stood in the security room, watching the screen play back the video from after 4 p.m. The image was very clear. Mr. Deng was wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap, walking next to a man carrying a briefcase. The two stood in front of the apartment door, talked to Thou for a few minutes, and then walked inside. Quan didn't blink as the man in the black shirt paced the hallway with his phone, calling someone. The security guard turned up the volume. The man's voice came out tinny but was still audible. This unit should sell quickly for over 2.5 billion. If the owner needs cash fast, we can push the price down further. I saw Quan's hand on the edge of the table slowly tightening, his veins visibly bulging. The security guard fast-forwarded to another clip. Deng was standing near the elevator, thinking no one could hear him. He whispered, but the camera still picked it up. Just get Quan to sign, and we'll have money by next week. My mom can handle him. He loves his mom so much. As those words echoed, I felt my blood run cold. It turned out they weren't just testing the waters, they had already planned how to force Quan to sign. Quan requested the entire video be backed up to a USB drive and a copy emailed to him. Ms. Thou also agreed to record a formal statement confirming the incident. Before leaving the apartment, Quan immediately changed the electronic door password and told Ms. Thou, from now on, besides me and my wife, do not open the door for anyone claiming to be family. If they come back, Call security directly and notify me. Ms. Thou nodded repeatedly. She was clearly shaken by the scare. On the way back, Quan said nothing, but this time his silence wasn't about restraint. It was like the silence before a decisive strike. When we arrived home, Mrs. Lee and Dong were still sitting in the living room. Perhaps they didn't think we would return so quickly, much less that we would have clear evidence in hand. Quan walked in and placed his phone on the table in front of Dong, the screen frozen on the image of him standing outside the apartment. Quan asked, "Explain this." Dong glanced at it, his face paled for a second, but he quickly forced a smile. "There's nothing to explain. I was just asking around. The family needs money, so I checked the price. Whether to sell or not is another matter." Quote. Quan didn't respond. He pressed play on the camera recording. Dong's voice rang out clearly across the living room. "Just get Quan to sign, and we'll have money by next week." The smile on Dong's face vanished, and Mrs. Lee turned pale, but after only a few seconds, she hurriedly chimed in. He was desperate, so he just acted recklessly. "Why do you have to nitpick every single word between brothers?" I gave a cold laugh. "Reckless, or are you planning to rob us, mother?" Mrs. Lee turned to glare at me, but this time I didn't look away. I looked straight at her, my voice very soft. "The house I own, you say belongs to the in-laws. The apartment my husband and I share, you want to sell too. So in the end, in your eyes, what is left for my husband and me?" Dong suddenly jumped up, his face beet red. "You're my own brother, yet you turn against me because of this woman." He pointed at me, his voice distorted by anger and humiliation. "I'm bankrupt. People are driving me into a corner, and you're still sitting there clinging to your house and property. If anything happens to me later, don't you dare regret it." Quan stepped up right in front of his brother. His voice wasn't loud, but every word was very clear. "It's not that I'm against you. It's that you're trying to push my wife and me out onto the street." Dong froze. Quan continued, "From now on, whoever touches that apartment, I will report it to the police. I'm not bluffing. I have saved the camera footage, the tenant's statement, and the management's records. If you want to test me, go ahead and try." Mrs. Lee slumped into her chair, her eyes turning red. But this time, she didn't cry out loud. Perhaps she understood that a second door had slammed shut in front of them. I stood beside Quan, feeling clearly for the first time that our little family was being eroded layer by his own relatives. And if Quan hadn't been level-headed and decisive, just one wrong signature would have cost us what took years to build. After the night Quan put a stop to the apartment scheme, Dong almost turned into a different person. Before that, he still knew how to come home, how to sit in front of his mother and pretend to be miserable and remorseful. But once he realized that we were no longer a lifeline for him to cling to, he began to disappear day and night. Some days he wasn't seen in the morning, and he wouldn't return at night. His phone was sometimes on and sometimes off. The messages Mrs. Lee sent only showed as delivered, never getting a reply. The creditors didn't disappear along with him. On the contrary, they showed up at the house even more. At first, it was just strange calls, with raspy male voices asking when Dong would pay up. Then came threatening messages sent to Ms. Lee's phone, accompanied by photos of the front gate. One morning, as soon as I opened the door, I saw red paint smeared all over the outer wall, with scrawled words underneath. "Pay your debt." Ms. Lee's legs turned to jelly when she saw it, and she had to grab the stair railing to stay standing. From that day on, she became even more panicked. Every day she came over, sometimes crying, sometimes begging, sometimes blaming us. She sat right in the living room, tears streaming down her face. "Quan, he's your brother. I know he was wrong, but if you don't save him, who will? I'm old now. How many years do I have left to watch my son being driven to his death?" Quan poured her a glass of water, but his voice was no longer as soft as before. "I've already said it, I will help in a legal way. I won't sell assets, I won't sign for loans, and I won't pay off any more shady debts." Ms. Lee covered her face and sobbed louder, but Quan remained unmoved. I knew he was hurting. After all, that was his mother and his own brother. But after everything they did to my house and our apartment, if Quan gave in one more time, our little family would be dragged down with them. About a week later, I went to meet a client in the suburbs. That day, the meeting dragged on until nearly midnight. As the car drove through a quiet stretch of road, I accidentally saw Dong stepping out of a karaoke bar with flickering purple lights, a flashing sign, and loud, thumping music and rowdy laughter spilling from inside. He was so drunk he couldn't walk straight, one arm draped over a scantily clad girl, the other holding a half-smoked cigarette. Walking beside him were several tattooed men wearing thick chains, who didn't look like respectable business associates at all. Another girl tugged on Dung's arm and giggled, "Dung, you have to treat us again today, right? Don't be stingy, you're a crypto tycoon." He laughed too, a twisted and hollow smile. Sitting in the car, I felt goosebumps watching that. The same person crying about having no money to pay debts was drunk in a nightclub a few days later as if nothing happened. Back home, I told Quan about it. He sat still for a long time, hands on his knees, his eyes darkening. After a while, he just said, "He's destroying the rest of his life." The words were soft, but they stung more than a scolding. I understood that Quan was no longer just angry. He was utterly disappointed. I later found out that besides that, Dung also frequented illicit massage parlors. At first, he followed bad friends just to pass the time. It became a habit. He drank constantly, hopped from one girl to another, spent the last of his spare cash, and even borrowed from acquaintances under the pretext of loan maturity. The scariest part was that he no longer wanted to fix his mistakes. He only wanted to forget, and the more he forgot, the deeper he sank. Once, near 2 a.m., Dung returned to Mrs. Lee's house, dead drunk. Quan and I were called over because she was afraid he would cause a scene. As I stepped in, I saw the tea table overturned and broken cups scattered on the floor. Dung stood in the middle of the room, eyes bloodshot, pointing at his mother and shouting, "If you gave birth to me but can't save me, don't call yourself my mother. You bragged to everyone about how capable I was, didn't you? Now that I need money, you're just going to stand there and watch?" Mrs. Lee cried until her voice was hoarse, but she still tremblingly opened her wallet to give him a few million. "This is all I have left. Just take it for now. Don't scare me like this." I felt a shiver down my spine watching that scene. The woman who once rushed to slap me just to get the red book to save her son. Now, she was being cursed right in the face by that very son. But even sadder was that even though she was cursed it, she still gave him the money. Does she love her son, or rather, has she become accustomed to compensating for all his mistakes with money and tears? Another night, Dung even dragged a strange girl back to a room rented by the hour near the night market. Whether it was because of a money dispute or the debt collectors had tracked down the address, a fight broke out there an hour later. The local police had to come down to resolve it. People recorded clips and posted them in the residential group. Even though Dung's face was partially obscured, our relatives still recognized him. Rumors started spreading fast, even faster than when Ms. Lee bragged about her successful son. Those who once heard her say Dung earned good money and was about to buy land or a car were now whispering that there was no sign of wealth, only debts and women. Some even intentionally said in front of Ms. Lee, "It's tough raising such a talented child, isn't it? Talented enough to have creditors show up at the door." Quote, "For the first time, I saw Ms. Lee bow her head when walking past a crowd of relatives. The pride she had clung to for so many years began to shatter into pieces. And from that moment on, I understood that Dung's tragedy was not just bankruptcy. The real tragedy was that he had never been forced to take responsibility for any of his mistakes. Until it was already too late. The fact that Dung was living extravagantly, owing money, and being hunted by creditors was enough to make Ms. Lee lose face. But back then, I still thought this was just a stumble of a greedy person wanting to get rich quick and failing. I did not expect that behind the so-called virtual currency investment, there was another layer of mud, deeper, dirtier, and involving many innocent people. That morning, I was at the office when Quan called. His voice was very low, and he only said one sentence, "Can you take a half day off and come home?" The economic police had just arrived at Dung's former company. The pen in my hand suddenly froze. I asked what happened, but Quan only replied, "Come home, then we'll talk. This is no longer just about debt." Quote, when I arrived home, Ms. Lee was sitting on the living room floor, her face pale and her hair disheveled. Her phone lay right next to her, the screen still lighting up continuously with incoming calls. Dung had locked himself in his room, ignoring Ms. Lee, who was pounding on the door and calling out until she was hoarse. I looked at Quan, and he showed me a message thread in the family group. Someone took a picture of the police working at Dung's old company, accompanied by whispers, "It wasn't a failed investment. They say it was a capital contribution scam." I read it and felt a chill down my spine. It turns out the crypto group Dung was involved in wasn't just a few people buying and selling and suffering losses. It was like a disguised pyramid scheme, painting a picture of high profits and promising weekly interest payments. Anyone who referred new people received a commission. At first, they let participants withdraw a little real money to build trust. Then, when the money poured in was large enough, the system suddenly locked accounts, the leaders vanished, and middlemen like Đăng were dragged out to pay debts and give explanations. What left me stunned was that Đăng didn't just put his own money into it, he had stepped up to pull in many acquaintances. Among them were several relatives from his father's side. Some retired uncles and aunts sold small plots of land, withdrew their retirement savings, or took out bank loans because they believed his words. Before, they trusted Đăng because Mrs. Lee bragged that her eldest son was capable, well-connected, worked in a finance company, and insisted that he was only sharing this opportunity because they were family. Less than an hour later, the gate to Mrs. Lee's house was filled with the noise of people. The first person to rush in was Uncle Trong, my father-in-law's cousin. He held a stack of transfer receipts, his face red with anger. The moment he saw Mrs. Lee, he shouted, "Where is Đăng? Call him out here. He told me to put in 200 million, with steady monthly interest. Now, where is my money?" Mrs. Lee trembled as she stood up, stuttering. "Please calm down, Đăng is a victim too." "A victim?" Uncle Trong slammed the stack of papers onto the table. He stood there giving presentations. He said there was a team of experts. He said his sister-in-law, the accountant, had checked it already. His younger brother, the engineer, believed it too, so his family put their money in. And now you say he's a victim? It was as if someone had splashed a bucket of cold water in my face. His sister-in-law, the accountant, had checked it already. That sentence made me stand there frozen in shock. I had never vetted any investment for Đăng. I have always even stayed far away from shady crypto dealings. Yet my name was used as a seal of approval for that scam. Quan immediately stepped forward and said clearly, "Uncle Trong, my wife and I have absolutely no involvement in this." Han had never checked, never signed, and never confirmed any investments for Đăng. Whoever claims otherwise must be held responsible. But in the heat of anger, those who lost money are hard to reason with. Another middle-aged woman, perhaps a distant paternal relative, pointed directly at me. "You're on his side too, aren't you? You're an accountant. How could you not know he was scamming people? Or were you pulling the strings from behind?" I looked at that woman, seeing her red-rimmed eyes, her hands clutching an old cloth bag containing, perhaps, all her loan documents. I was angry, but I couldn't bring myself to hate her. Those who lose money often just need a place to vent their pain. I took a breath, went into the room to get my laptop, and opened all my personal and joint bank statements. The messages where I had refused to participate in Đang's investments, even the recording of the lender calling to ask about the house deed a few days ago. I laid it all out in front of everyone. "Please, take a good look. I haven't received a penny from Đăng, haven't transferred money to any platform, and certainly haven't guaranteed anyone's loans. If Đăng used my name to build trust, I am also a victim of his exploitation." The living room fell silent for a moment, and some people started picking up the documents to read. Some were still angry, but their gazes were less harsh than before. Quan didn't hesitate any longer. That very afternoon, he called a friend who is a lawyer. He said very concisely, "I need to legally distance my wife and me from this liability. My brother has shown signs of using our family name to entice others to invest. I don't want my wife dragged into things she had no part in." Hearing Quan say that, I finally felt truly afraid. Once your name is used to deceive people, being just one step too slow could pull me into a cycle of accusations, explanations, and suspicion, even though I am completely innocent. As for Đăng, after learning his old company was being investigated and relatives were coming to demand money, he completely collapsed. That night, he locked himself in his room, wouldn't eat, and wouldn't answer anyone. Mrs. Lee sat outside the door, crying until she was hoarse. "Đăng, open the door for Mom, don't scare me like this." But inside, there was only the sound of objects being thrown to the floor, then silence. Around 10 p.m., Quan had to break the door down, fearing he might do something reckless. Đăng was curled up on the bed, with a pack of sleeping pills nearby that had a few missing, luckily not to a dangerous level yet. Quan pulled him up and slapped him lightly on the face to wake him. His voice shook with anger. "If you had the guts to drag all those people into this, then open your eyes and face it. Don't be such a coward as to leave your mother to bear it all." I thought things were horrible enough already, but the very next morning, before the house had a moment of peace, a young woman wearing a mask arrived. I recognized her. She was one of the two girls who had been with Đăng at the dim-lit bar the other day. She stood at the gate, eyes dark and sunken, her voice low but cold. "Is Đăng home?" Mrs. Lee scowled the moment she saw her. "Who are you? Here to demand money again?" The girl didn't argue. She just looked toward the room where Đăng was locked inside and said something that left the whole house stunned. "No, I just came to give him a heads up. Dong should go get a blood test. No one could say another word. The wind from the yard blew through the door frame, icy cold, and I stood there, feeling as if another storm had silently arrived, darker and more terrifying than all the previous deaths. The masked girl's words made the entire yard go quiet, as if someone had suddenly sucked all the air out. Mrs. Lee stood frozen at the door, eyes wide as she stared at the girl, while I felt a chill run down my spine. Dong, hearing the commotion from his room, opened the door and stepped out, looking gaunt with bloodshot eyes from many sleepless nights. The moment he saw the girl, his face darkened instantly. "What are you doing here?" he growled. The girl pulled her mask down slightly. Her face was very young, but her eyes were weary and cold. "I already told you, you should get a blood test. Don't wait until it's too late to regret it." Dong let out a sneering laugh, a dry sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Trying to pull another extortion stunt? You girls can't extort any more money, so you've turned to scaring people with diseases, right?" The girl didn't get angry. She just looked at him for a long time and said, "I'm not asking you for a cent, and I don't need you to believe me, but who have you been with? You know best what you've done." Quote. After speaking, she turned and walked straight away, leaving Mrs. Lee standing dazed in the yard. Dong even shouted some nasty insults after her, calling her a liar and claiming that all those women in those places are only good at bleeding desperate men for money. At first, Mrs. Lee also tried to defend her son. She slammed the gate shut, and as she turned back inside, she spoke as if to reassure herself. "She's just trying to scare us. Those kinds of girls off the street, when they see our family in turmoil, they just try to find a way to get money." But I saw her hands trembling. Even though her words sounded firm, there was a clear trace of fear in her eyes. Some words sound groundless at first, but if the person involved has lived recklessly, they act like a hook catching them right at their weakest point. For the next few days, Dong still acted indifferent. He locked his door, sometimes sleeping heavily, sometimes shouting, and sometimes going out until late at night. But by the fourth day, his body started showing strange signs. It started with a high fever. Mrs. Lee cooked porridge, sponged him down, and forced him to take fever reducers, but his temperature kept fluctuating wildly. Then I heard her panic as she called Kwon over because lumps had appeared on Dung's neck, and he was exhausted with a gray, ashen face. Kwon looked at his brother lying on the bed, soaked in sweat, and didn't speak for a long time. Mrs. Lee stood by his side, her voice trembling. "It's just exhaustion, right, son? He hasn't been eating or sleeping well these past few days, and with those people threatening him, that must be why." Quote. Kwon replied very softly, "Mom, take him to the doctor. Stop guessing." Mrs. Lee turned even paler when she heard the word doctor. Perhaps the girl's words were still hanging in the back of her mind, only she dared not name it. That afternoon, Mrs. Lee took Dung to the hospital. Kwon and I did not go with them, partly because Kwon knew his brother was ashamed, and partly because he wanted his mother and him to face the consequences themselves before involving anyone else. All evening, our house was unusually quiet. Kwon sat on the balcony, smoking one cigarette after another, even though he rarely smoked. I sat inside, my heart uneasy as I kept checking my phone. Near 9 p.m., Kwon's phone rang. As soon as he saw it was his mother, he answered immediately. I couldn't hear what was said on the other end. I only saw Kwon's expression shift bit by bit, from tense to pale, then sinking as if something very heavy had just fallen on him. He said, "Where are you, Mom? I'm coming right over." Quote. Then he stood up, grabbed his car keys, and turned to me, saying his mother wanted us to come over. She was crying so hard she couldn't speak clearly. When we arrived, Mrs. Lee's door was ajar. The living room lights were bright, but the atmosphere inside was strangely cold. Mrs. Lee sat on the floor, her back against a chair leg, arms hugging her knees, her whole body trembling, her hair disheveled, her face looking 10 years older after just one afternoon. Seeing Kwon, she looked up, her lips trembling but unable to make a sound. From Dung's room came the sound of furniture breaking. He had locked himself inside, smashing things like a madman. "Don't look at me, Mom, don't look at me like that." His voice was raspy, drowning out the sound of him throwing something against the door. I stood at the threshold, my feet feeling as if they were glued to the floor. On the tea table lay a crumpled test result paper, its edges wrinkled and stained with water streaks. I couldn't tell if they were tears or raindrops. Kwon leaned down to pick up the paper. He opened it, read a few lines, and then fell silent. I saw his hand freeze in midair. Without him saying a word, I could guess that the most terrible thing had happened. A moment later, Kwon folded the paper and set it back on the table. His voice was so low it was almost just a whisper. Dung is HIV positive. The air in the room thickened. I didn't know how to react. I didn't feel disgusted by Dung as a sick person. What stunned me was the feeling that everything was free-falling so fast, from showing off wealth to bankruptcy, then swindling acquaintances and living in debauchery. And now, a medical report shattered the last shred of Mrs. Lee's hope. Mrs. Lee suddenly wailed, a heartbreaking cry like a wounded animal. Why did it come to this, my child? What did I do wrong to make you turn out like this? Inside the room, Dung banged hard against the door. Mom, shut up. Stop crying. Why are you crying? You're disgusted by me, aren't you? You look down on me now too, right? Mrs. Lee rushed to the door, crying and pounding on the wood. No, I'm not disgusted by you. Open the door for me. I beg you. I turned away. That sight made my chest tighten. The woman who once stood before me, forcing me to sell my house, slapping me just to save her eldest son, is now kneeling before that very son's door, pathetically helpless. Her arrogance is gone, and there are no more words about blood, duty, or pride. Faced with that test result, all the words she once used to pressure others became meaningless. Quan gently pulled me out to the yard. He stood under the eaves, looking into the pitch-black night, and said softly, "This is the real price of living without limits." I didn't answer. I only felt a heavy weight in my heart. There are mistakes that can still be paid for with money, houses, or assets. But there are mistakes that, once committed, leave one only able to watch the consequences follow them for a lifetime. Inside the house, Mrs. Lee's crying continued in waves. She sobbed and muttered, "If only I hadn't spoiled him back then. If only I had let him fall once to know what pain felt like. If only I hadn't always assumed my son was right." The if-onlys fell onto the cold floor, agonizingly late. I knew from that moment on, Mrs. Lee truly began to collapse. Not because of the lost money or the lost face before relatives, but because for the first time, she was forced to face the truth. It was her own blind pampering that contributed to pushing Dung to this day. But it was already too late, and on that heavy night, none of us knew that the test results weren't the final shock. Because when someone lives recklessly for too long, the consequences never stop with just that person. After the night she held those test results, Mrs. Lee seemed soulless for days on end. She stopped wearing makeup, stopped calling relatives to brag, and no longer sat on the porch boasting about her talented eldest son. Every morning as I passed by her house, I saw her sitting silently in the living room, staring fixedly at Dung's bedroom door. That room remained shut almost all day, occasionally punctuated by dry coughs, heavy footsteps, or the sound of things being knocked to the floor. At first, I thought this time she had truly come to her senses. A mother, seeing her child fall into debt, scandal, and illness all at once. Perhaps, no matter how stubborn one is, they must feel some self-reproach. But I was wrong. Mrs. Lee was indeed broken, truly in pain. But that pain did not lead her toward the truth. It only made her need someone else to blame. And the easiest person for her to blame was none other than my husband and me. That afternoon, Quan went over to her house to deliver some papers the lawyer asked us to prepare. I went along because there were some bank statements related to the time she had borrowed money from me. As soon as we entered, I saw Mrs. Lee sitting before the altar, holding prayer beads, mumbling to herself, her eyes bloodshot. Seeing us, she turned slowly, her eyes no longer empty but filled with resentment. She spoke very softly, but each word hissed through her teeth. "If you two had saved your brother that day, he wouldn't have turned out so reckless." I froze. Quan, who was placing the papers on the table, also stopped in his tracks. Mrs. Lee stood up, tears beginning to stream down her face, her voice rising. "If you two had agreed to sell the apartment and given him the money to pay his debts, he wouldn't have had to hide from creditors or wander into those filthy places. His illness is also because you pushed him into a corner." I looked at her, unable to believe I had just heard those words. Even now, when everything has been laid bare, she still refuses to face Dung's mistakes head-on. He made shady investments, dragged others into his schemes, squandered money at clubs, and used my property deed for illegal loans. Yet, after all that, she concludes that it's our fault for not giving him money that he ended up this way. Quan looked up at his mother. His face was so cold that I could clearly see the exhaustion in his eyes. He said slowly, "Mother, Don't turn Dung's consequences into my wife's and my crimes. Mrs. Lee immediately retorted, you speak so well. He is your own brother. Brothers in the same family. Yet you calculate every penny and every piece of paper. Now he is sick. Are you satisfied yet? Quote, Kwon replied, I am not satisfied to see him sick, but I also won't take the blame for things he did himself. Suddenly, Dung opened the door and stepped out from the room. He had withered away, his beard was stubbly, and his eyes were bloodshot and cloudy. He looked at us for a moment, then let out a distorted laugh. What else is there to say? Everyone in this house already considers me trash. Mom cries, my brother preaches morality, and my sister-in-law stands there looking like a judge. Quote, with that, he slammed his hand against the wall and screamed, where is the money? Do you have any money left, Mom? I need money. They are messaging me again. Quote, Mrs. Lee panicked and immediately ran to support him. Calm down, my son. I will take care of it. I'll handle it. Quote, I saw her rummage through her bag and pull out some crumpled bills to give him, but Dung slapped them to the ground. What is this pocket change for? Do you think they need money for a drink? Quote, he turned to Kwon, his eyes bloodshot. You still have that apartment, you still have savings. Are you really going to let me die? Quote, Kwon did not back down. He simply said, you need money to pay off legal debts. We will sit down with a lawyer. If you need money to keep hiding things and continue being led by the nose, I won't give it. Quote, Dung lunged as if to grab Kwon by the throat, but after 2 steps, he stopped due to a violent coughing fit. Mrs. Lee hugged him, crying and scolding Kwon. Do you see this? Your brother has ended up like this, and you are still so heartless. Quote, just then, a loud banging at the gate erupted, and a middle-aged man shouted, open up, get Dung out here right now. Ms. Lee started, her face drained of all color. Kwon stepped out to open the gate, and I followed closely behind. 5 or 6 people stood there, all with tense expressions. There was Mr. Trong, a middle-aged woman I had seen among the relatives, and an elderly man with white hair leaning on a cane, clutching a stack of bank transfers neatly kept in a plastic folder. The old man stepped into the courtyard, trembling. As soon as he saw Ms. Lee, he pointed his cane at the tiled floor. Choked with emotion, he said, I trusted him because you bragged about how capable your son was. You said he worked in finance, that he knew how to make money, and that he only let family in on it. Now my retirement savings are completely gone. What are you going to do? Ms. Lee opened her mouth but could not utter a word. The people who came with him also began to clamor. One person demanded 300 million, another had lost 50 million. Some said their children back in the countryside were blaming them for taking out bank loans based on Dung's advice. Then someone held up a phone. On the screen was an old clip of Dung live streaming, dressed in a sharp suit, sitting in front of a luxurious backdrop with a confident smile. This opportunity isn't for everyone. Those who trust me will thank me in a few months. Money in the bank is dead money. You have to know how to make money work for you. That clip used to make Ms. Lee swell with pride. Now it played right in her own courtyard like a second slap, striking directly at the vanity she had clung to for so many years. Hearing the noise, Dung retreated into his room and slammed the door shut. He didn't dare to show his face. Ms. Lee stood in the middle of the courtyard, between the angry people who had lost their money and the locked door of the son she had once boasted of as her pride and joy. Her lips trembled, and her hands hung limp at her sides. Watching that scene, I felt no sense of satisfaction. I only saw that the reputation of the brilliant son she had painted for years was finally turning back to crush her. Kwon had to step in, asking everyone to calm down and suggesting a meeting with a lawyer to separate each claim and determine liability. But people who have lost their money are not easily calmed. Mr. Trong shouted, if he's sick, that's his problem, but what about our money? If he won't show his face, his mother must answer for him. Mrs. Lee took a step back, nearly falling if she hadn't gripped the edge of the stone table on the porch. Just as the atmosphere was stiflingly tense, a child's sudden cry erupted from the gate. Everyone turned, and a young woman stood there, holding a boy of about 3. The child clung to his mother's neck, his face flushed from crying. Yet, his eyes and the bridge of his nose bore a striking resemblance to Dung. The woman looked straight into the house. Her voice was low, yet it silenced everyone. I am looking for Nguyen Min Dung to tell him that his son has arrived. Mrs. Lee stood frozen, her prayer beads slipping from her hands and scattering across the courtyard. Inside the room, the door had cracked open just a sliver before suddenly stopping. I could clearly see Dung's silhouette behind the gap, his face as pale as someone seeing their greatest debt come to collect. The woman walked into the courtyard very slowly, holding the child in one arm and an old cloth bag in the other. She wasn't dressed gaudily, nor did she look like someone who had come to cause a scene. Her face was thin, her eyes dark and weary, yet her gaze was remarkably lucid. The lucidity of someone who had cried too much and suffered too much to even scream anymore. Mrs. Lee looked at her, then at the child in her arms, her lips trembling. "Who are you? What did you just say?" The woman set the child down beside her, gently stroked his hair, and replied, "I am Mai Fuong. I used to work in the same investment group as Deng." Quote, upon hearing the words investment group, the people in the courtyard immediately began to buzz. Mrs. Lee stepped back again, her face turning even paler. Perhaps those two words alone were enough to haunt her. Mai Fuong paid no attention to the eyes of the crowd. She opened her bag, took out a stack of documents neatly clipped in a plastic folder, and placed them on the stone table. "Today, I haven't come to stir up jealousy or to beg for pity. I have come to claim my child's rights." The child tugged at his mother's shirt, his confused eyes looking around. He was still too young to understand why the adults were looking at him with such heavy eyes. Mrs. Lee's voice trembled. "What rights? What does your child have to do with my family?" Quote, Mai Fuong took out a birth certificate. "I was standing close, so I saw it clearly." The father's name section was left blank, but immediately after, she opened her phone and placed a series of old messages in front of Mrs. Lee. Among them, Deng's number had messaged, "Wait until I get through this. I'll come home and talk to Mom. The child is mine, I won't abandon it." Another message wrote, "Don't put my name down yet. I'm doing big business, it's not convenient to go public." Mrs. Lee held the phone, her hands shaking so much she almost dropped it. She stammered, "Impossible. My son Deng isn't married and has no children. He never told me anything about this." Mai Fuong gave a faint smile. That smile wasn't mean, but it sounded very bitter. "It's natural that you wouldn't know. He only tells you things that make you proud. You brag everywhere about his success, but for 3 years, he hasn't even provided enough for diapers and milk." That sentence made the whole yard go completely silent. I looked toward the room door. Deng was still standing behind the crack but didn't come out. His shadow cast onto the tiles, motionless like someone trying to shrink away from all the truths closing in. Quan looked straight ahead, his voice dropping low. "Come out here." There was no answer. Quan continued, his tone sharper, "How many more things are you hiding?" A moment later, the door opened, and Deng stepped out, his face ashen, his lips cracked and dry. As soon as he saw the child, his eyes quickly darted away. That avoidance was answer enough for everything. Mrs. Lee looked at her son, her voice trembling. "Deng, tell me, is this child yours?" Deng swallowed hard, daring not to look at his mother, nor at Mai Fuong. He only muttered, "That's all in the past, Mom. I was just so confused back then." Quote, Mai Fuong let out a laugh, but her eyes turned red. "It's in the past for you, but for me, it's been 3 years of raising a child alone. When I was pregnant, you told me not to worry, that you were about to make a lot of money, and you took over 200 million from me, saying you'd invest it, and we'd buy a house when we married. I believed you because I was stupid, because I thought you were sincere." She turned to Mrs. Lee, "And when he lost everything, he just disappeared. When our child had a fever, he wouldn't answer my calls. We had no money for milk or doctors, yet I kept seeing photos of him drinking and partying." Mrs. Lee collapsed into her chair. It was the first time I saw her unable to argue, talk back, or defend her son by saying he was pushed into a corner. Standing before her wasn't an aggressive creditor or a stranger here to curse her out, but a woman her son had cheated, robbed, and abandoned with an innocent child. But Mai Fuong didn't stop there. She pulled a stack of bank statements and placed them on the table. "I also came here for this. Before Deng went bankrupt, he told me he was penniless and that all his money was stuck in the exchange, but I had an acquaintance check it. In the 2 months before the exchange crashed, he transferred nearly 700 million to a strange account." The whole yard buzzed with noise again. 700 million. That number made the people outside who had lost their money gasp instantly. Quan picked up the statement to look at it. He frowned and took a photo to send to his lawyer. I saw his expression grow increasingly grim. Not long after, Quan's phone chimed. He read the message, was silent for a few seconds, then looked up at Deng. "This account belongs to a girl named Nan, who works at the massage parlor you frequent, right?" Deng's face turned deathly pale, and Mrs. Lee couldn't believe her ears. "What massage parlor? Who did you send money to? What's this about 700 million? Deng waved his hands frantically, saying it's not what everyone thinks. "She was just holding the money for me. I was afraid creditors would freeze it, so I asked her to keep it. Kwon gave a cold laugh. Holding it for you, yet every transfer was marked as a gift. Birthday, buying a car, rent payment. Do you think everyone is as stupid as you want them to be? Mai Fuang hugged her child tightly, her eyes turning cold. So, while I was borrowing every single million for our child's medicine, you were transferring 700 million to another woman. While you were here forcing your sister-in-law to hand over her house deed to save him, he was still hiding money to spend on his mistress. She looked Mrs. Lee straight in the eye. Do you still think your son was a victim of life? He was the one who ruined other people's lives first. That sentence fell into the yard like the strike of a blade. Mrs. Lee clutched her chest, gasping for air. Dong stepped back, his back hitting the door, with nowhere left to deny it. The people who lost their money standing at the gate also fell silent for a few seconds. Then the cursing erupted again. But this time they weren't just cursing because of lost money. They were cursing because they realized the man who used to preach about getting rich had used his family's name to borrow from them. It turned out he wasn't just a failure, he was rotten to the core. I looked at the child burying its face in Mai Fuang's shoulder, and my heart sank. The child didn't understand anything, but it was living proof of a part of Dung's life he tried to hide. And Mrs. Lee, who once believed her eldest son was her pride and joy, now had to watch his masks being stripped away right before her eyes. No longer rich or successful, no longer pitiable, no longer a victim of life, he was just a greedy, irresponsible man who had left so many hurt people in his wake. After that afternoon, when Mai Fuang brought the child to the house, Dung completely lost control. If before he could make excuses about being swindled, blindsided by the market, or misled by friends, now every secret he kept was exposed to everyone. Creditors remained relentless, and those he lured into investing began gathering documents to file formal complaints. Mai Fuang demanded a DNA test and insisted he take responsibility for child support. The entire fake world Dung had built collapsed in a single day, leaving not a single piece intact. Since that day, Mrs. Lee has barely slept, sitting in the living room, calling one person after another. Sometimes pleading, sometimes blaming, sometimes crying that her son is ill, begging everyone to give him a way to live. But those who lost their money no longer had the patience to listen to a mother covering for her son. They only responded with cold remarks. My money is also my way to survive, Mrs. Lee. As soon as a call ended, she slumped over the table, her shoulders shaking, while Dung locked himself in his room like someone fleeing his own life. I thought after all those events, he would know fear and finally stop. But for someone used to having their mother clean up every mistake, when backed into a corner, the first thought isn't to take responsibility, but to find a way out. That night, the weather turned cold, and Kwon and I returned home after working with our lawyer all afternoon. Exhausted, I fell asleep early. Then around 1 a.m., Kwon's phone suddenly vibrated incessantly on the nightstand. I opened my eyes to see Kwon had already bolted upright. His phone screen displayed a notification from the security camera in his home office. After the documents were copied and went missing, Kwon had installed a small camera aimed at the filing cabinet and the drawer holding the spare keys. At the time, I even asked him if he really needed to be that cautious. He only said he could no longer trust them to act reasonably. Now, looking at the cold blue light on the screen, I finally understood that his caution had saved us once again. Kwon switched to the live feed. In the dim frame, a figure was hunched over the desk. The person wore a black jacket and a baseball cap pulled down low, but I recognized that silhouette immediately. It was Dung. He was opening the drawer with a small key, rummaging through folders, his movements hurried and shaky. I felt my entire body go cold. Kwon didn't shout, nor did he rush downstairs immediately. He just watched the screen for a few seconds, then grabbed his phone to call the local police and text his lawyer. I whispered, "Let's go down and stop him." Kwon shook his head, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly low level. "No, if we catch him at home, Mom will just say he was desperate and made a poor choice. We need to see where he takes these documents." I looked at my husband, seeing him calm for the first time in a way that made me shudder. It was no longer the forbearance of a son afraid of upsetting his mother. It was the clear-headed resolve of a man pushed to his absolute limit. On camera, we saw Dung take the spare apartment key along with a stack of papers related to the rental contract, copies of the sale agreement, and several property records from who knows where. He stuffed everything into his pockets and crept his way out. Kwon immediately grabbed his coat and pulled me along with him. He didn't turn on the lights, just locked the door quietly and headed to the basement for his car. We followed him from a safe distance. Đăng took a taxi out of the complex, heading toward an all-night cafe near the real estate brokerage area. It was nearly 2 a.m., but the lights were still on inside. A few men sat around a table, with stacks of documents, a laptop, and some envelopes of cash in front of them. Seeing that scene, my heart began to pound. This was no longer a family conversation. This was a calculated transaction. Quan stopped the car across the street, called the local police to give them our location, then walked in with me. But he didn't walk straight over. He stood in a hidden corner and turned on his phone's voice recorder. I heard a man faintly say, "That place is worth over 2.5 billion on the market, but if you need cash urgently, we can only put down 1 billion. Where is the power of attorney?" Đăng answered very quickly. "My brother will sign it later. I'll take the deposit now, and I'll force him to sign tomorrow. The family has stuff going on, he won't dare to make a scene." The other person frowned. "Without the owner's signature, it's too risky." Đăng lowered his voice. "I am his older brother. My mother agrees too. That house is family money. His and his wife's names are just on the deed. Just draw up the deposit receipt. I'll take full responsibility." Quote. Hearing that, I clenched my fists until it hurt. He was no longer just a man at his wit's end. He was trying to sell something that didn't belong to him with a blatant lie. Just as Đăng picked up the pen to sign the deposit paper, Quan stepped forward. He placed his recording phone on the table, his voice cold as stone. "Go ahead and sign. Once you sign, this turns from a family matter into a criminal file." The pen in Đang's hand dropped onto the table, rolled once, and fell to the floor. His face went deathly pale. The men sitting with him also stood up in shock. One of the brokers immediately changed his tone. "You're Quan, right? We don't know anything about this." Quote. Đăng said the homeowner's brother had verbal authorization. "We were just helping look." Quan looked at him with a cold smile. "Verbal authorization to sell a billion-dollar asset. You guys are in this business, yet you actually believe that?" Just then, the local police stepped in, and the atmosphere in the shop became tense immediately. Đăng stammered, I only plan to rotate the money temporarily. I haven't really sold it or taken the cash yet." Quan took a USB drive from his pocket and placed it on the table. "The camera shows you sneaking into the office. The messages to the broker, the recording of you forcing me to sign. It's all here. Whatever you want to say, tell it to the police." Đăng looked at me, his eyes filled with both desperation and resentment, but I did not turn away. I wanted him to understand that this time, no one would be blinded by tears or the word brother anymore. Đăng was taken in for questioning that very night. When Ms. Lee heard the news, she rushed to the police station, barely able to stand on her own feet. As soon as she saw Quan, she grabbed his arm, her face twisted in tears. "Quan, please withdraw the report. Your brother is sick. He panicked and did something reckless. Forgive him this one time. I'm begging you." Quan gently removed her hand. He looked at her for a long time, his eyes pained but unyielding. He said, "I have forgiven him many times. This time, you're asking the wrong person." Ms. Lee froze. He continued, every word as heavy as stone. "The victims aren't just me, but my wife, our small family, those Đăng cheated, and the child he abandoned. You can't just cry and expect everything to be wiped away." Quote. I stood behind Quan, watching his silhouette under the cold white lights of the police station. For the first time, I saw him truly cut off the last bit of weakness he had toward his family. Not cutting off family ties, but cutting off that kind of family bond that uses tears to cover up wrongdoing. And I knew that from that moment on, Ms. Lee and her son could never drag us into their mud ever again. After the night Đăng was summoned for secretly using apartment documents to take a deposit, Quan barely slept. He didn't say much, but I knew he was sorting everything out in his mind. On one side was his desperate mother, on the other was his sick brother. Drowning in debt, committing one mistake after another. But there is also me, my parents' house, our apartment, the elderly people who lost their money, my Phuong, and her 3-year-old child who did nothing wrong. The next morning, Quan's lawyer proposed a private confrontation before all parties officially filed their complaints and submitted complete dossiers to the authorities. Not to cover for Đăng, but to clearly distinguish which parts were civil debts, which showed signs of fraud, and which involved the unauthorized use of my family's asset information. Quan agreed. He made it very clear, I will not pay his debts, but I also won't let him drag any more innocent people into the mud. The confrontation took place in a small meeting room at the law firm. The room wasn't large, just a table, a few chairs, and a glass window overlooking the busy street below, but the atmosphere inside was so heavy that I felt if anyone breathed too hard, everything would shatter. Present there were Ms. Lee and Deng. My Fuang carried her child, and Uncle Trong represented several people who had been lured into investing. My spouse, myself, and the lawyer. As soon as Ms. Lee walked in, she grabbed Deng's hand tightly. She looked at everyone with eyes that were both fearful and defensive, as if this whole room were conspiring to corner her son to his death. Deng kept his head down, looking gaunt, his hands clasped together and trembling slightly. There was no trace left of the man who once wore a suit to livestream about profits, opportunities, and financial freedom. Before me at that moment was just a man surrounded by his own lies with no way out. The lawyer opened very directly, placing 3 folders on the table. We will clarify this group by group. 1. The money that investors transferred to Deng or through Deng's referral. 2. Deng's use of Han's asset information to apply for loans without her consent. 3. Deng's civil liability toward Mai Fuang and her child. Upon hearing that, Ms. Lee burst into tears. You all make it sound so terrible. He is wrong, but he is my son. Are you trying to force him to die? No one answered immediately. Mr. Trong sat across from her, slowly taking a settled savings passbook from his pocket. He placed it on the table, his aged hand trembling. I have children too, Mrs. Lee. I saved this passbook for over a decade, planning not to burden my children if I fell ill later. Deng came to my house and called me uncle. He said he was only giving this opportunity to family. I trusted him because you bragged about how capable he was. Now my money is all gone, yet you ask who pushed him to his death. Then who cares about my money? Mrs. Lee was struck dumb, tears still flowing, but her defense of her son caught in her throat. The lawyer did not let emotions steer the confrontation too far off course. He opened the first file, listing each transfer, each message where Deng promised profits, and each video where he guaranteed the information. Some amounts were tens of millions, others were hundreds of millions. Each number read aloud hit the table like a stone, heavy and cold. Then it was Mai Fuang's turn. She didn't cry, she just opened her cloth bag, took out a white envelope, and placed the DNA test results on the table. Her voice was hoarse, but very clear. I don't force anyone to love me. I just need Deng to accept his proper responsibility to his child. The lawyer looked at the document and said briefly, the results show that the biological father-child relationship between Deng and the child is confirmed. The room went completely silent. Mrs. Lee turned to look at the child sitting nestled against his mother. For the first time since meeting the boy, her gaze was no longer filled with doubt or denial. She watched him for a long time, her lips trembling. Perhaps she was looking for traces of her own son on the child's face. And the more she looked, the less she could deny it. Deng still bowed his head without saying a word. That silence was not because he was wronged, but because all avenues for denial had been blocked. The lawyer proceeded to open the second file. At this moment, I saw Mrs. Lee start to fidget. Inside were call logs from the lender confirming they had received my house documents. The account history was created using Deng's phone number. The reference information listed Mrs. Lee, along with a list of photocopied documents once taken from the cabinet. The lawyer made it very clear that using Han's property information and personal documents for a loan application without her consent cannot be called asking for help. This is an act showing signs of infringing upon property rights and personal information. Mrs. Lee hurriedly waved her hand. I just thought I'd do it first to be in time. If she agrees, she signs. If not, then so be it. I never intended to rob anyone. I looked at her, my heart growing cold. Even now, she still uses the words, do it first, to cover up something calculated behind my back. Quan sat beside me, having been very quiet until now, but upon hearing his mother say that, he looked up. His eyes were no longer filled with noisy anger, only deep disappointment. He looked straight at Mrs. Lee, his voice firm. You once slapped my wife over the red book. You scolded her for not knowing how to save family members. Now look, what has the person you forced me to save actually done? That statement made Mrs. Lee look as if all her strength had been drained. She turned to Deng, her hands gripping the edge of the table tightly. Tell me, is there any part of this that people are framing you for? The whole room waited for an answer. Deng looked up slightly, his eyes red and lips trembling, but in the end, he bowed his head again. Not a word of defense, not a single rebuttal. That very silence crushed Mrs. Lee. She slumped into her chair, her body limp, muttering, my spoiling you has only harmed you. I thought loving you meant protecting you. Unexpectedly, Deng burst into tears. This time it was not like the previous times he threw tantrums for money. no shouting, no blaming others. He just covered his face, his shoulders shaking in spasms. The sound of those cries felt both pathetic and belated. Sitting opposite him, I felt no satisfaction, only a chill down my spine. A family can fall apart without needing any major catastrophe from the very beginning. It just takes a child who is overly spoiled, a mother who lives for face, and small mistakes that are overlooked time and time again. Eventually, it becomes a chasm deep enough to swallow everything. At the end of the meeting, Juan stood up and spoke slowly and clearly. Without evasion, my wife and I will not pay any of Dung's debts. Our assets will not be used to compensate for his mistakes. But I will help provide documents and work with lawyers to clearly separate responsibilities. Any amount he owes, or any sign of misconduct, will be left for the authorities to handle. Mrs. Lee did not react. She just sat still, eyes staring blankly at the files on the table. Mai Fuang picked up her child and stood up first. Uncle Tron also took back his emptied savings book, walking out with his back even more hunched. I followed Quan, my heart feeling heavy. That confrontation did not save anyone immediately, but at least it forced everyone to face the truth. And sometimes, for families accustomed to covering things up for too long, the truth is the most painful blow. After that confrontation, things could never return to the way they were. Dung had to face every consequence he had tried to avoid for so long. Those who were lured into investing began filing complaints. Lawyers worked with each party to distinguish between civil loans and signs of fraud. Mai Fuang also initiated legal procedures to confirm his responsibility toward the child. As for that illness, though no one wanted to mention it, it still loomed silently like a long shadow, forcing him to start treatment and learn to live differently if he wanted to salvage anything of his future. Mrs. Lee changed a great deal afterward, the woman who used to love sitting at family dinners, bragging about her eldest son's success. Now she rarely leaves the house, and if anyone asks about Dung, she just bows her head, mumbles a few words, and walks away. On her face, there is no longer that pride, nor that haughty tone when claiming her son was better than others. On some afternoons, I pass by and see her sitting alone on the porch, fingers counting prayer beads, eyes gazing at the gate for a long time. I don't know if she is hoping for her son to return to normal or reflecting on the years she loved him the wrong way. Dung is no longer the man who screams and demands money like before. Perhaps when a person is pushed to the limit and has to face both illness and the law, that stubborn outer shell gradually falls away. He is quieter now and has grown much thinner. Sometimes I hear from Quan that he is cooperating to clarify the funds in the investment scheme, while also starting treatment under a doctor's guidance. I don't know if he will truly change later on, but at least from that moment, no one else can step in to pay for his mistakes. One afternoon, Mrs. Lee came to my house. She stood outside the gate for a long time without ringing the bell. I watched through the camera, seeing her keep raising her hand and then lowering it. Her frame looked much smaller in that old brown shirt. Quan went to open the door. She stepped in without looking around the house like before, and her tone was no longer commanding or accusatory. She stood in the middle of the living room, hands tightly clasped together, taking a long time before finally saying, "Han, I apologize for that slap the other day." I looked at her, but in my heart, I could not say I had forgotten. That slap didn't just hurt on my face, it hurt because it showed me how little I had been valued. But I also did not want to hold on to bitterness forever. I replied very slowly, "I accept your apology, but I will not allow that to happen ever again." Mrs. Lee nodded, tears falling, but she offered no excuses, didn't claim she was panicked, nor that she lost control because she loved her son. To me, that silence was a rare moment of retreat on her part. Quan stood beside me, his voice softer than before but still very firm. "From now on, you can see us whenever you want. I am still your son, but please never bring Dung's debts to this house again." Mrs. Lee bowed her head and whispered, "I know," just those two words, but they sounded weary and heartbreakingly late. Afterward, Quan processed all the paperwork again. The apartment locks were changed, the lease was updated, and a clause was added to prevent anyone but us from interfering. My private house also had its documents thoroughly reviewed. The originals were sealed, and copies were stored in a safe place. These tasks sound dry, but for me, they are how we protect our lives after such a long storm. Someone asked me if I felt satisfied seeing my mother-in-law and brother-in-law face the consequences. Honestly, no. I just feel tired, sad, and realized that life sometimes goes downhill not because of one big fall, but because many small mistakes are overlooked. Đăng didn't fall into the abyss just because of one failed investment. He fell because of the times he lied and was still believed, the times he was wrong but still protected by his mother, and the times he caused trouble thinking someone else would pay for it. As for Quan, my husband, he isn't someone who speaks well, nor is he the type of man who is always strong and loud. But at the most critical moment, he stood right in front of me. He protected me, protected my parents' house, and protected the small family we have tried to build little by little. After all, what made me realize I didn't choose the wrong husband wasn't whether he was rich or successful, but that when standing between his own mother and what is right, he refused to let his wife be sacrificed. The day Mrs. Lee left, Quan walked her to the gate, and I heard him say very softly, "Mom, you didn't lose Đăng because Han wouldn't give up the deed. You lost him from the day you taught him that someone else would always pay for his mistakes." Mrs. Lee stood silent for a long time, then nodded through her tears. I closed the door and looked at the quiet house in front of me. It is still the same old house, the same table, the same window, with raindrops still lingering on the porch. But in my heart, everything has changed. I kept the house, kept my honor, and most importantly, I kept a marriage that still knows how to stand on the side of what is right. For me, after so many storms, that is already a very precious piece.